He walked into the hall with slow, measured steps, his posture upright but aged, his eyes carrying decades of stories never told. Some noticed the faded jacket, the weathered hands, the deliberate way he looked around. But few noticed the depth of who he was. To most, he was just an old man who had wandered into a formal event where he didn't seem to belong. A quiet hum of disapproval spread across the room. Someone near the entrance gave a half-hearted attempt at kindness, saying, "Sir, I think you're in the wrong place." The tone wasn't curious. It was dismissive. It wasn't meant to guide him. It was meant to move him along. He didn't react. He simply stood there, breathing in a space where he wasn't welcome. People returned to their conversations, laughter resumed, and eyes turned away as if pretending he had already left. But he hadn't. He stood there, still as stone, absorbing the energy of a room that didn't know his name, didn't care to ask, and had already decided he didn't deserve to be there. And yet, he did. Far more than most in that room. The power of silent respect over loud prejudice is not always immediate. It doesn't come crashing through walls or shattering glass. It slips into a room quietly and changes everything without raising its voice. In that moment, as he stood waiting to be acknowledged, 6 Navy SEALs across the room began to rise, one by one, then all together. They didn't say a word. They didn't shout or scold or demand attention. They didn't need to. They walked across the room slowly, their uniforms clean, their movements precise, and their purpose unmistakable. Every eye in the room turned. Conversations fell away mid-sentence. Phones were lowered. Sips of wine paused in midair. No one could explain why the SEALs stood. No one knew who the man was. But the silence said enough. When they reached him, they stood still for a beat, and then, without instruction, they raised their hands and saluted. No words, just the quiet gravity of acknowledgement. And that was when the room finally saw him, not just as a man, but as a veteran, a warrior, a symbol of something larger than appearances. Because prejudice always speaks first. It's quick, loud, reactive. It sizes someone up in seconds and speaks in tones of arrogance, assuming without knowing. But respect, that deep, earned, soul-level respect, often arrives without a word. It stands still. It looks you in the eye, and it doesn't care about your assumptions. It only cares about truth. This wasn't about a confrontation. It wasn't about making a scene. It was about 6 men recognizing someone who had paved the path long before they walked it. Because real soldiers, real men of service, don't measure worth by youth, by skin, or by popularity. They measure it by sacrifice, by the pain someone has endured, by the battles they didn't brag about, by the way a man enters a room with quiet confidence, even when the room would rather he didn't. People began to murmur again, this time not in judgment but confusion. Whispers turned into questions. Who is he? Why did they salute him? Did he serve? And in the space of a single moment, the loud judgment of a crowd was overtaken by the louder silence of 6 men who knew better. They didn't know the room an explanation. The man didn't know the room a story, but their act told one anyway. A story of legacy, of brotherhood, of unshaken honor in the face of ignorance. And that is the difference between prejudice and respect. Prejudice enters fast and makes decisions without truth. Respect waits, watches, and then moves with purpose. It doesn't require applause. It doesn't announce itself. It just stands, when standing is what's needed most. The old veteran didn't need to defend his presence. He didn't have to justify his life. Those 6 men, in a gesture that lasted less than a minute, said more about who he was than any speech could have. They didn't need to speak for him. Their silence spoke for itself. His jacket was faded, the colors dulled by time and sun. The stitching on the sleeve was slightly frayed, and a single brass button looked newer than the rest, likely replaced after years of wear. He didn't walk in like he owned the place. He walked in like he belonged, quietly, respectfully, as someone who had been taught long ago that dignity wasn't something you shouted about. And yet, in the eyes of those already seated in the room, none of that mattered. His jacket didn't sparkle. His shoes weren't polished. He didn't wear the sharpness of ceremony. He wore the history of service. Someone glanced at him, then looked away. Another whispered something behind a hand, followed by a chuckle not meant to be heard by him, but loud enough to be felt. It was clear from the shifting in seats, the glances exchanged, and the silence that stretched too long, that people were wondering why he was there. The uniform, or what was left of it, didn't impress them. The quiet way he moved didn't inspire admiration. He wasn't adorned with the kind of sharpness that made people snap to attention. In that room, appearance was being measured, not meaning. Too often, we confuse image with importance. We assume that the loudest voice must be the leader, that the cleanest suit must carry the greatest authority, that the most rehearsed words must hold the deepest truth. But real dignity rarely comes wrapped in perfection. It comes through wear and resilience, through repetition and survival. His uniform wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to serve. It had done its duty, again and again, long before anyone in that room had decided it looked unfit. What they saw as worn, he wore as a badge. Not because of ego, but because of memory. Every crease, every scratch, every faded patch spoke of something endured, a mission, a moment, a memory that stayed even when the colors dimmed. But people didn't see that. Not right away. They were looking for shine, for medals, for a version of honor they could photograph and post. There's a deep misunderstanding about uniforms. People think they're about appearance, about presentation. But they're not. They're about responsibility. A uniform is a commitment. A quiet contract that says, I'll carry the weight, even when you don't see it. And the weight he carried couldn't be seen in fabric. It lived in his bones, in his silence, in the way he didn't argue when someone told him this was a private event. He simply stood there, patient, not pleading, because he didn't need to prove anything. The truth is, honor doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need decorations to justify its worth. And sometimes, the most decorated people are the ones you overlook, simply because they don't feel the need to explain who they are. That's what makes real honor so easy to miss. It doesn't posture. It simply is. The 6 Navy SEALs who stood up didn't do it for applause. They recognized something in him the room had missed. They saw the weight, the history, the quiet dignity he carried. They saw not just the uniform, but the man inside it. And they responded, not with noise, not with speeches, but with a gesture more powerful than any words. What people forgot that day is that a uniform is not a costume. It's not worn to impress others. It's worn because of what it represents, a life of discipline, of duty, of stepping into places most people run from. When a man wears a uniform, no matter how aged or faded, he wears the memory of standing between danger and safety, between fear and order, between loss and protection. And yet, that's often forgotten in rooms more concerned with polish than presence. The irony is that some of the cleanest uniforms have never seen a battlefield, and some of the most disrespected ones have carried their wearers through hell and back. Real honor doesn't shine, it endures. It doesn't speak loudly. It stands quietly, even when uninvited, even when unseen. And it doesn't ask to be recognized. It simply shows up. In that room, the man's uniform didn't command attention by its look. It did so by its history. And the SEALs saw it for what it was, not a display, but a legacy. They understood that what most overlooked was, in fact, what mattered most. Not the style, not the shine, but the story stitched into every fiber of that old, worn fabric. There's a kind of weight that doesn't sit on your shoulders, but deep in your chest. A pressure that builds over years, pressed into place by silence, by struggle, by being seen and unseen all at once. That's the weight many Black veterans carry long after the battles have ended. Long after the medals have been boxed up, the boots have been stored away, and the salutes have faded into memory. It's not the physical toll of war that lingers the longest. It's the way a nation can celebrate your service in uniform and then question your place in line, your voice in the room, your worth in everyday life. He carried that weight as he walked into the building. He wasn't loud. He wasn't asking for anything. He entered with the calm presence of someone used to being tested, used to watching eyes scan him before a word is even spoken. To them, he was an old Black man with a tattered jacket. But that jacket had been earned. That walk had been forged in the discipline of military cadence. That silence wasn't emptiness. It was patience, sharpened by years of holding back when he could have spoken out, standing still when others would have broken. The war he fought overseas ended decades ago, but the one he returned to never truly stopped. He had stepped off the battlefield and into another fight, one where the enemy wore a suit instead of a uniform, where the front line was a job interview, a voting booth, a dinner table, a sidewalk. A fight where he had to prove, again and again, that his value didn't vanish the moment he took off his boots. That being a soldier wasn't the only thing that made him worthy of dignity. He didn't talk about the missions, the near misses, the friends he left behind in foreign deserts or jungles. He didn't talk about how he learned to sleep with one eye open, or how certain sounds still made his muscles tighten. He didn't talk about what it was like to return to a country that applauded the uniform but avoided the man inside it. These were not stories for public consumption. These were memories he had learned to carry in silence. But silence has a cost, especially when that silence is demanded by a world that only wants to hear your voice when it suits them. A world that will cheer you in parades, but ask you to leave the room when you're no longer needed. That's the wound too many black veterans carry. A wound not from bullets or shrapnel, but from being dismissed after doing everything right. From serving with honor only to come back to a place where your service is footnoted, your humanity questioned, and your pain overlooked. The room he entered didn't know all this. They didn't see the man. They saw their assumptions. They measured his worth by the state of his clothes, the color of his skin, the quiet way he held himself. Some may have thought he was lost. Others assumed he was intruding. Very few, if any, looked at him and thought, warrior, leader, survivor. But the 6 Navy SEALs saw it instantly. They knew the weight he carried because they carried parts of it too. They knew the 1,000-yard stare. They recognized the posture of someone who had seen more than he'd ever say. They didn't need an introduction. They didn't need a speech. Their training had taught them to see what others missed. And what they saw in him wasn't just a veteran. It was a man who had served in 2 battles, one overseas and one at home. The weight of being a black veteran is not just in what you've done, but in how the world responds after you've done it. It's in the split-second judgments, the murmurs in public spaces, the doors that stay closed despite years of sacrifice. It's in knowing that you bled for a flag that sometimes forgets your name, that you stood for a country that too often turns its back, that the medals don't guarantee respect, and the salute is sometimes only given when someone else reminds them to give it. He wasn't asking for anything that day. Not validation, not applause, just space. Just the right to exist in a room without being told he didn't belong. But because of the uniform he once wore and the skin he was born into, he was asked to leave. Until 6 men stood up, not to fight, not to argue, but to shift the weight, to carry it with him for a moment, to remind the room that this man had already carried enough. He stood at the edge of the room, not looking for attention, not demanding recognition. There was a calm to him, not born from indifference, but from long familiarity with being underestimated. The kind of calm that comes from years of doing the right thing without needing applause. He wasn't out of place because he didn't belong. He was out of place because the people in the room didn't know how to recognize someone like him without a proper introduction. They saw an old black man in a dated military jacket, and in that single glance, most of them decided he didn't matter. But real honor doesn't come from appearances. It doesn't come from who announces you or where you sit. It comes from who acknowledges you, even in silence. He didn't flinch when someone suggested, politely but firmly, that this was a private event. He simply looked at them, nodded slightly, and remained still. He knew that tone. He'd heard it 1,000 times in 1,000 different ways, whether on a sidewalk, in a store, or now in a room that claimed to respect service but failed to recognize sacrifice. Real honor isn't loud. It doesn't always carry credentials or demand explanation. Sometimes, it just waits for the right eyes to see it. There's a difference between being invited and being welcomed. He had served in a country that invited him to fight, but didn't always welcome him back. He had worn the uniform, followed orders, risked his life beside others who would later forget his name the moment the mission ended. He had stood under the same flag, bled in the same mud, and yet came home to a world that didn't see him the same way. Not because of his actions, because of his skin. But in that room, someone saw. 6 men, seated quietly at the back, stood up in sync. They didn't shout. They didn't scold. They didn't even speak. Their actions didn't need volume. They carried authority in silence. They walked slowly to where he stood, their presence shifting the energy of the entire space. People began to whisper. Some turned to watch. Others froze. The room had grown used to ignoring him. Suddenly, it couldn't. When they reached him, the 6 Navy SEALs formed a line. They stood straight, chests high, and then each one, without instruction or ceremony, raised a hand in salute. No fanfare, no announcer, just a quiet recognition of something too many in the room had failed to see. They didn't salute a jacket. They saluted a legacy, a life that had paved the path before theirs, a man who had done his part long before they were even in uniform. They honored not just his service, but his endurance. Honor is often misunderstood. Many think it's tied to status, to medals, to promotions. But those things fade. What doesn't fade is the kind of honor that survives disrespect, the kind that stands firm when ignored, the kind that doesn't need to shout to be heard, the kind that shows up in old jackets and silent rooms and knows it's enough just to be. He didn't return the salute right away. He looked at each of them, eye to eye, and for a moment, everything paused. There was no music playing, no speech being given, no camera flash. Just a mutual understanding. A silent transfer of respect from one generation to another, from one warrior to 6 others. From a time when serving didn't guarantee appreciation to a moment when appreciation finally arrived, late but sincere. The people in the room had assumed he was nobody, but those 6 men knew better. They understood that you don't measure a man's worth by the sharpness of his clothes or the invitations in his hand. You measure it by the battles he's fought and the dignity he's carried through each one. By the silence he's held instead of speaking back to ignorance. By the way he doesn't let the world define his value, even when it tries. Real honor doesn't come from rank. It comes from recognition. From the ability to see past assumption, past prejudice, past the noise of status, and into the truth of character. The SEALs didn't stand up because they were asked. They stood because they knew. They didn't need a briefing. They didn't need confirmation. The moment they saw him, they knew exactly who he was. Not his name, not his record, but the weight he carried, the presence he held, the kind of presence only earned through years of giving more than you get back. There are things only a soldier understands. The silence in the eyes of someone who's seen more than they'll ever say. The instinct to scan every room, even in peace. The reflex to carry weight for others, without being asked. But deeper than training, deeper than protocol, there is something stronger, a bond. One that is rarely spoken, never forced, and impossible to fake. It's a bond that lives between warriors, no matter their age, no matter their branch, no matter the years that separate them. It lives in moments, in gestures, in silence. It's the kind of bond that makes 6 Navy SEALs rise in unison when they see a man the world overlooked. He had walked in without ceremony, just a quiet presence in a room that didn't expect him. His jacket was older, his steps slower. But there was something in the way he held himself that told the truth long before anyone asked for it. The room didn't notice him the way it noticed others. To them, he didn't arrive with status or introduction. He arrived with history, worn on his shoulders, heavy and invisible. Most didn't see it. They were too busy deciding whether or not he fit in. But those 6 men saw it immediately. It wasn't about what he wore. It was how he carried it, how he stood, how he waited. It wasn't deference or uncertainty. It was discipline. There's a posture that never leaves those who have served, a rhythm that stays in the bones, even after the war is over. And when you've lived that life, even for a moment, you recognize it in others. That's what they saw. That's what made them rise. They didn't check with each other. They didn't need to. The moment demanded it. The air had shifted. In a space filled with conversation and performance, something real had entered the room. Something that couldn't be ignored, not by them. Not by men who knew what it meant to be overlooked and still serve. Not by men who had seen bravery in all its forms. Loud, quiet, young, old, and in the face of doubt. They stood because he stood. They honored because he had already honored them, long before they knew it. That unspoken bond doesn't care about age. It doesn't measure experience by recency. It doesn't require similarity in skin or story. It only asks one thing. Did you carry the weight? Did you wear the uniform not just on your chest, but in your choices? Did you show up when it mattered, even when it cost you? And if the answer is yes, that bond appears. Not always loudly. Often in the smallest moments. A nod. A grip of the hand. A salute. There's a kind of respect that can't be taught in training. It can't be legislated. It can't be posted on a wall. It lives in the eyes of those who've stood on the edge of fear and still moved forward. That's what tied those 6 men to the man in front of them. A man whose battles were both visible and invisible. A man who returned home not to parades, but to closed doors. who served a nation that didn't always serve him back. And yet, he still showed up. They didn't ask his name. They didn't need his resume. They saw his silence. They saw his presence. And they answered in kind. Because warriors don't need introductions. They need recognition. They need each other. When the world turns its back, when the crowd misjudges, when the system forgets, it's the bond between warriors that holds the line. There was no speech given that day. No announcement explaining why the Navy SEALs stood. But no one who witnessed it forgot. Because in a single moment, 6 men reminded the room what it means to truly see someone. To see beyond the surface. To see the years behind the man. To see the story in the silence. That kind of respect isn't given because of popularity or position. It's given because someone knows. Someone sees the weight, sees the sacrifices, sees the quiet pride of someone who has given much and asked for little. That's what bound them together in that moment. Not politics, not race, not age, just the shared understanding of what it means to serve, to endure, and to carry on even when no one's watching. It was a passing moment in time, but it carried the strength of a lifetime. No headlines, no camera flashes. Just 6 men standing in silence beside one who had stood alone for far too long. He entered quietly, as if he had done it 100 times before. There was no hesitation in his steps, but there also wasn't any expectation. He wasn't looking for a welcome. He wasn't waiting for anyone to guide him to a seat. He had learned, long ago, that certain rooms would never be made ready for him. That no matter what he had given, no matter what he had earned, there would always be places where his presence would feel like a disruption instead of a contribution. Still, he showed up. Still, he stood. No one turned to greet him. Eyes glanced over him without stopping. Some stared a little too long, just enough to signal discomfort, but not enough to claim responsibility. His jacket, though faded, bore the marks of someone who had seen the world under the worst of conditions. But it didn't sparkle. It didn't announce rank or shout recognition. It simply told the truth, if anyone was willing to read it. Most weren't. They were too caught up in appearances, too busy protecting the space they thought was theirs. The silence he met wasn't the respectful kind. It wasn't filled with reverence or reflection. It was a silence of dismissal, the kind that grows when people have already decided who you are before you've said a word. He wasn't young. He wasn't white. He wasn't dressed the way they expected. And because of that, they saw someone without value. They didn't ask his name. They didn't consider his history. They assumed he didn't belong. But silence works both ways. It can be a tool of exclusion or a mirror that exposes everything people try to hide. That day, their silence said more about them than about him. And when the 6 Navy SEALs stood, their silence was even louder. Without speaking, without asking, they broke the room wide open. They didn't need to be told who he was. They knew. Not because of his appearance, but because of his presence. They saw it the moment he walked in. The way he carried himself. The discipline in his posture. The weight behind his stillness. Each of them had worn the uniform. Each had carried the burden of service. But they understood something deeper, that not all burdens are carried equally. That for some, the fight doesn't end when the uniform comes off. For a black veteran, the battlefield continues in streets, in offices, in moments like this, where he's told without words that he doesn't deserve to stand in the room he helped defend. They didn't need to hear his story to know it existed. They didn't need proof. They recognized the kind of man who had been through more than the world gave him credit for. And they responded not with outrage, not with noise, but with stillness. 6 men standing without instruction. 6 men choosing to be counted when the rest of the room stayed quiet. It wasn't just respect. It was accountability. It was visibility. It was truth. That one act exposed everything. It forced the room to look again, to question what they had missed, to realize that their assumptions had not just been wrong, they had been loud, that they had said more by their inaction than they ever could with words. And now, in the face of 6 silent soldiers standing tall, their discomfort turned into guilt. There's a moment, in every room, when the energy shifts, when what was ignored suddenly becomes undeniable. This was that moment. They hadn't expected to be challenged. They hadn't expected to be taught a lesson without a single sentence spoken. But here it was, delivered in silence, wrapped in posture, sealed with presence. Because silence doesn't always protect. Sometimes it reveals. It shows who will stand and who will sit, who will see and who will look away, who will act and who will wait to be told what's right. And in that room, only 7 men stood, 1 because he had to, 6 because they chose to. The rest were left with nothing but silence, and the knowledge that they had failed to see a man whose story was written in every thread of his coat, in every inch of his back that had carried this country even when it refused to carry him. What happened that day wasn't a protest. It wasn't planned. It was the truth, made visible through action. The kind of truth that doesn't shout, but never goes unheard. The kind that makes a room confront itself. The kind that turns quiet into clarity and shame into stillness. The kind that doesn't just shift the air, but clears it.